So a very confusing gospel, I think, and we get to listen to Proverbs a little bit. We don't spend a lot of time in wisdom literature, which is too bad, but hopefully I will be able to bring this together a little bit, because there's some very odd things that are spoken in this gospel. Sort of like when those of us who remember Desi and Lucy, and Desi said to Lucy, "You got some splaining to do." Well, we're going to do some splaining this morning and sort of unpack the gospel and get to what the real meaning here is. Sometimes what we read in Scripture isn't exactly what is intended, at least through our eyes. And so the title of the sermon is Living the Verb. And I'll give you a heads up for confirmation notes. You don't have to do that yet. But the verb is faith. Faith for John is not a noun, it is a verb. And we'll see how that plays out. John is very interested. Now, we have to remember that the Gospel of John was written 30 to 50 years after Jesus' death. So it's a totally different audience than anybody else in the New Testament is writing to. And he has some different things to say and in different ways. John is especially concerned about Jesus as God and Jesus as man. Jesus is both divine and human. And it gets very complicated, and this is where the Jews were having a huge time with this. The way that John does this is he uses 7 I am statements. These statements start with I am, and they are contained only in the Gospel of John. You will see these nowhere else in the Bible. So he uses these statements as sort of a liturgy going through the life of Jesus. Where it gets complicated, and this is where I think that some of the dispute with the Jews was truly there. In the Greek, the words I am are actually written ego eimi. So if we were to write ego in English, it would be ego. So it's ego, I. So it's translated I. Here's where it gets interesting. Eimi is a verb of being, which actually means I am. So Jesus, according to John, is saying, I am. Now, he could have just left it with eimi, left ego out, and that would have been fine. But what Jesus is doing here, according to John, is really making a point with the Jews who are still disputing who he is. So what Jesus is saying is, I am. And we see this later when he talks about the bread of life and compares it to manna, which the Jews enjoyed in the Old Testament when they were in exile. And it compares it saying, I am the bread of life, not like the manna that your ancestors ate and they died. You eat my flesh and drink my blood and you will live forever. So that's one point that the Jews, I can appreciate this, would really bristle at him saying this. The next part is even more complicated, where he compares, when he tells them to eat his flesh and drink his blood. What Jesus is doing here, and it almost sounds cannibalistic in a way, but what Jesus is doing here is this is an in-your-face discussion about who he is. You can imagine the Jews, this is just a little synopsis of what the whole dispute and the whole conversation was going on. Jesus here is making a really strong point. It's not the manna that God gave your ancestors, it's me. Everybody comes through me. So I can imagine that how upset the Jews were. Now, the interesting thing is about the I am statements and this is that some Christian churches even today use those to be exclusive, saying it's only through Jesus that you can get to God. And of course, we don't believe that. We believe that God is working through us. We're Christians, we're here, and that's how God is relating to us. But we know there are other faiths and other beliefs that God is also using. God can do and relate to people however God chooses to do that. So these I am statements and this blood and flesh statement has to be taken in context. And so, and it's interesting, the Gospel of John is the only gospel that has no reference at all to Holy Communion, to the sacrament. So some people try to make this statement into a sacramental statement, which it cannot be, because John never even refers to the Last Supper. So that's my splaining. And so I hope you get a sense of what this is about and don't let some of these key words hang you up into understanding what this is really about. Because now we get to wisdom. And Proverbs that was read this morning is the heart of wisdom literature in the Old Testament. And this will not surprise many of you that wisdom is female in the Old Testament. The women are nodding. A lot of the men are saying, well, yeah, you're right. But wisdom is always female and always comes from a female perspective. And there are a lot of different verses just in this little snippet that was read this morning that we could talk about. But the one that interests me the most in connection to John is the one where it says, everyone, even the simple, are invited to walk in the way of insight. Even the simple. That's us. That's me. That's you. We're not high priests. We're not rulers of countries. We're not kings. We're not generals. Some we have retired generals, but you're not generals in the armies now. We are the simple people who come to walk in the way of insight. And that's part of what John is trying to get to, too. This gift of faith, this verb, is for everyone, and it's not exclusive to anyone. And it's really important for us to remember this. Faith, this verb, has to do with relationships. It has to do with love, being loved and loving. It has to do with forgiving and being forgiven. The word, the context here of this word, faith, is clearly a verb. You can see it in Jesus where he says eating and drinking, and you can see it in Proverbs where she says walk your life. Walk into insight. You are all invited into that. So this is a little explaining, a little proclamation, and now we're going to listen to some singing, because what Olivia and Jenna are going to sing for us is a song that has to do with relationships. It has to do with this wisdom that she has taught us and continues to teach us. And I'll put the words on the wall while they sing. Ready?